So you're very welcome to the third session of the day, Coleridge and the Ancient Mariner. Now, Richard was going to do a PowerPoint display. Unfortunately, we have no screen here. Rupleena is going to display some of the images on the laptop, and we'll try to find a better method, but I think we'll at least have to start like that. This is the way the PowerPoint will appear. Please join me in welcoming Richard Holmes and Rupleena Bose.
Well, it's lovely to be here. I was told I was coming to heat and dust. But I also know rain is good in Rajasthan. And I know the wheat is growing faster. And this is what Coleridge, mariner, said about rain. They've been dry for weeks and weeks. The silly buckets on the deck. Okay. Can you hear now? At the back. Okay, if you stop hearing, wave, all right? Because we're under slightly unusual circumstances, okay? So you're hearing this? Okay. So we were talking about... Hello? Is that on? I can't hear anything. I don't think it's on. Can it go on? How's that? Ah. Should we go with that? Is that better? Over there in the corner, can you hear? Yeah, up there? Okay, we're talking about rain. We're talking about rain in Rajasthan. And I was giving you Coleridge's take on rain in Rajasthan, which of course is from the Ancient Mariner, a time the whole crew dying, and in fact have died from drought. And this is what the mariner says when he wakes to the rain. The silly buckets on the deck that had so long remained, I dreamt that they were filled with dew. And when I woke, it rained. My lips were wet. My throat was cold. My garments all were dark. Sure, I had drunken in my dream, and still my body drank. That's just a tiny segment from this extraordinary poem which I wanted to talk about. It's quite representative because that's a very physical image, but we know he's thinking about drinking in a different way, something to do with what's happening to his spirit inside him. And what I want to do in the little time we've got without the PowerPoint is try and unpack a little bit about the mystery of this poem. And then later we'll expand it, we'll talk about my Coleridge biography perhaps, and the Age of Wonder in which Coleridge appears. I know we've got a lot of students here who are familiar with the poem, and I want to say immediately that the PowerPoint that I brought will be available. I'll leave it on the laptop there, so eventually you'll be able to see it, all right? Because I brought it and did it all for you, so I want you to see it, all right? And I know Coleridge has a lot of fans in India, so it's to him. And I also want to say that for a biographer, rain is a good thing. There's a famous festival at Hay-on-Wye where it's always like this. It's always mud up to your knees. It's even more muddy than Glastonbury, all right? And I remember once going in to talk there, plodding through the mud. As I got to the door, a Welsh voice called out, "Hello, Mr. Holmes. Fine weather for biographers." And then he added in a low voice, "Plenty of feet of clay." So we're used to that. A little scoop for you as we come into this. Coleridge has a very special connection with India that I don't think is known. Quite apart his interest into writing and the mythology, Coleridge had two elder brothers, John Coleridge and a very handsome brother, Frank Coleridge. And those two lads came to India to be as part of the East India Company. Frank arrived here when, can you believe this, when he was only 12. As a midshipman, they arrived in Calcutta. He joined his brother, and they wrote home a series of letters to Coleridge's family. He was the last of the children when he was 8 and 9. These travel letters, they were in the army here, but they wrote about being in India. And these letters, they took months to get back, but they eventually arrived at his little house in Devonshire, in Ottery St. Mary. And that was his first image of the distant world, of a world to be explored. Can you imagine? He worshipped these two brothers, particularly Frank, who was quite close to him in age. So Frank's letters, written when Frank was then 14, 15, 16, were being read to the young Coleridge back in the churchyard, which is where his father and the church. And he had this image of India, and therefore an image of a distant world, and therefore the whole idea of exploring. And this is the beginning of the inspiration for the Mariner poem. Now, those letters have not been known. They've been in a lost archive, and they've finally been printed. And here they are. And I think this may be the first copy in India. And if my friend who I've not yet met, Professor Magda Mudalia, are you here? I'm here. Lovely, greetings. I have brought this book for you and for your students, all right? And so you will see this new connection to be made, and we'll feed it into the poem, all right? So you're going to get this afterwards. And one other thing is there is actually a wonderful book called Coleridge and Hinduism by an Italian scholar, Anatella Natale, which has been a favorite book of mine. And I only discovered, just before I set out, I looked up where it's printed. It's printed, or dedicated to me, you see, printed by a small publishing house in Jaipur. So that's an extraordinary connection there, and I brought that book as well, all right? Yes, good. Right, so what I wanted to do, what I was going to do, was show you the Doré pictures of the Ancient Mariner. But what we'll do, we'll take advantage of this, and I'll tell you the story. You all know the story. I'll just remind you a little bit of it. It's quite a complicated, subtle story. And I will read tiny sections from it. Is that a waving can't hear over there? Right. I'll keep working at it. And keep waving if you can't hear, right? Everybody knows it's to do with the shooting of an albatross. What people don't think about is what's the big story it's set up in. It's about a ship that goes somewhere in the Antarctic Ocean, probably, with a crew of 200. And every one of that crew dies, except one man. And that's his story. So it's someone who's come out of a complete disaster. That's the Coleridge concept. It's a survivor narrative. And when we're thinking about meanings, one of the possibilities, ways of looking at this poem, it is someone who's suffered from traumatic stress syndrome. Somebody who's come back from a war, come back from the most personal tragedy. All the crew around him have died. And worse than that, he comes to believe he is responsible for their death. Now, post-traumatic syndrome does produce various effects we now know in modern psychology. One is the need to repeat your experience, and that's exactly what the Ancient Mariner feels he's got to do, is repeat the story again and again. And the other thing is it produces flashbacks and hallucinations and hearing voices. So all the hallucinations in the poem may be, in modern eyes, the result of post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's one way of looking at the meaning of the poem. But of course, there's another, and we're going to look more closely into this, that it's a kind of spiritual voyage, where something terrible happens for some particular reason to do with the mariner's connection with the natural world, and some kind of revenge is taken on him, and some kind of redemption is possible. So there's a spiritual meaning to the poem as well. And there are other possibilities. For example, we know that Coleridge, even at this point, was an opium addict. And it is possible that much of the imagery has come from his opium dreams. We know Kubla Khan, he expressly said, was a result of an opium dream. So that's a third way of looking at the poem. Now, let me just take you, just to remind you of it. First of all, the argument. This was the first edition. It's very important because there are three versions of this poem. It was first originally written very quickly, but then he went back and revised it, and he revised it again, and we'll look at those three versions. This is what he wrote in the little prose, what he called the argument, to explain the theme of the poem. How a ship, having passed the line, that's the equator, was driven by storms to the cold country towards the South Pole, and how from thence she made her course to the tropical latitudes of the great Pacific, and how the ancient mariner cruelly and in contempt of the laws of hospitality killed a seabird, and how he was followed by strange judgments. All right? Now that's his first prose account. And I would then going to show you, of course you can't see it, hold it up. This is one of the many illustrations. And remember, the students will eventually see this. Do you want to stand up and see? So imagine this on a huge screen. All right. But don't worry also. It's just, it's there. Another thing, finally, just before we go through the poem, it is probably the most illustrated poem in English literature. Possibly Paradise Lost is more illustrated. And there are interesting reasons for this, why it has inspired artists, something to do with the visual structure and scenes of the poem. So let me just take you quickly through it. You remember it begins, it is an ancient mariner, he stoppeth one of three, and it's three wedding guests, and he starts the repetition of his story of how his ship went from a little port, and we'll have a look at that port because we know where it was now, and it went southwards, driven by winds, and then it gets locked in the ice somewhere in the south, not South Atlantic, but near the South Pole. And I just want to read you a tiny moment there, a tiny moment where it gets locked in the ice and what happens. And the other reason why I'm very pleased to read this is because there's something wonderful and magical about this form of poetry, with, you'll see, very tight rhymes, very vivid imageries, which I think, and we've been talking a lot about students to this, that we've certainly in England rather lost the feel for this. Our poets don't write like this anymore. They don't use rhyme, and therefore it's very difficult to learn poetry by heart anymore. And I personally think this is a great problem in modern teaching of literature, that particularly young children are not encouraged to learn the music of poetry by heart. And particularly this poem depends on a kind of music. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice, mast high, came drifting by, as green as emerald. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound. At length did cross an albatross, thorough the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul. We hailed it in God's name. A good south wind sprang up behind. The albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. In mist or cloud, or mast on shroud, it perched for vespers 9, while all the night through fog, smoke white, glimmered the white moonshine. Come back to the image of the moon. God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee so. Why look'st thou thus? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. Very violent finish. And there is no explanation of why he did it. Why did he shoot the albatross? And look, that's the first of the unlocked meanings of the poem. You're left with why should he do this? The sailors think it brings the good wind, but then it brings bad wind, and they're marooned, and they're suffering from drought, and the albatross, famously, is hung round the mariner's neck. And then there are a series of extraordinary hallucinations, and again we've got pictures of that, but which you can't see, but I'll describe. The most vivid is a thing called a spectre ship. A ship appears, although there's no wind, and draws alongside, and it's framed, it's like a skeleton. You can see all the bare boards of the ship, and it's got 2 figures on it. And one of them is a death's head, and the other is a woman who's called the Nightmare, Life in Death. And they dice for the soul of the mariner. The dicing is again very strange, because why should it be decided by the fall of dice? On what particular symmetry are we looking here? I'm talking about Marcus de Soto, I think. It's very interesting why that happens, another mystery. And what happens is the death's head wins the entire crew, and the Nightmare, Life in Death wins the mariner. And we'll go back to that figure. Who is she? What's she doing there? And then when you think about it, there's a lack of women in the whole poem, except for the bridesmaid right at the beginning in the wedding feast. So the only 2 women in the poem are the bridesmaid going to the marriage feast, who appears at the beginning and the end of the poem, and this terrifying woman, Nightmare, Life and Death, in the middle, sitting on the spectre ship. So that sets up an interesting dichotomy, and we'll go back to that. The dead crew all curse him with their eyes. A terrifying passage. Although they're dead, their eyes stick on the mariner. And this is the beginning of this terrible sensation of guilt. And the ship sails on with him alone, imagine the situation, with 199 bodies, all apparently looking at him. It is indeed a nightmare, life and death. And then he begins really to go mad. He sees from their eyes, he looks over the water, and the water appears to be rotting and full of strange creatures. And then something very extraordinary happens. I don't know if you've got 10 there, if you can come up with that. Let me just read a tiny bit of this. And this incident, remember the power of illustration, how this would appeal to the illustrator. Beyond the shadow of the ship, I watched the water snakes. They moved in tracks of shining white, and when they reared, the elfish light fell off in hoary flakes. Within the shadow of the ship, I watched their rich attire, blue, glossy green, velvet black. They coiled and swam, and every track was a flash of golden fire. Oh, happy living things! My tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart. I blessed them, unaware. Sure, my kind saint took pity on me, and I blessed them, unaware. The self-same moment I could pray, and from my neck, so free, the albatross fell off and sank like lead into the sea. A famous moment. And there again, on the edge of a mystery there, what is it that frees him? He forgets himself. He forgets this horrific situation he's in. He just for a moment looks at the beauty of the creatures in the sea, and instinctively he blesses them. Very strong piece of romantic doctrine here, that nature and the human heart respond to each other despite the terrible circumstances. And he instinctively blesses them. How beautiful they are. Very, very simple thought. How beautiful this part of nature is. And that is somehow what releases him from this terrible curse that he has on him. So, a key moment. In fact, his penance, as they call it, goes on. There's an extraordinary another passage where the polar spirits, two of them, discuss him. He's lying there. Is he hallucinating? Will he get home? The phrase is, he has penance more to do. But he does get home. And again, this extraordinary passage where he suddenly sails into the harbour and he recognizes the church and the light. And in fact, what we'd now call the Coast Guard, rows out towards the ship with a holy man, the hermit, in it. And you think, what's Coleridge going to do with this? He's got a ship like the Marie Celeste with 199 dead people on it and one survivor. And in fact, the polar spirit, which has followed him all the way back home, strikes the ship, it sinks, and the mariner is picked up in the Coast Guard's boat. And there's something very interesting that happens. He looks so fearful that the Coast Guard and the boy in the boat go kind of crazy, go mad. And the boy says, the devil knows how to row. They think he's a demon come back. And he asks, the ancient mariner asks the hermit to bless him, and that is when the duty, the penance he has to do is to tell this story again and again and again. And the mariner, of course, at this point is still young. But when we meet him, he is the ancient mariner. He's gone on living with us, telling this story, all right? So that, in very simple form, is the shape of the poem. And I've suggested some of the mysteries connected with it. What I was going to do with the PowerPoint is take you back, and I will quickly be able to do this, to Coleridge and how this came to be written. Coleridge was 25 at the time. This is 1797, 1798. He was living in a tiny cottage on the edge of the Quantock Hills, and he had got to know the greatest friend of his life, William Wordsworth, and Dorothy Wordsworth, Wordsworth's sister. Dorothy was keeping a journal, and we know with later poems from that journal, Coleridge used phrases, for instance in Christabel, but the journal hadn't started at the time he set to work on this poem. So it's one of the mysteries of literary history is we do not know how far Dorothy Wordsworth contributed to this poem. And I don't think there's ever going to be a way of knowing because her journal doesn't begin. But that's to be borne in mind. And remember, I raised this question of the presence of the women on either end of that thing, the bridesmaid and the life and death woman on the Spectre ship. And the question of the female influence on this poem is very interesting. Somebody said, I was talking about this in New York, and an Indian student came up to me and said, surely all mariners always have someone they love waiting for them in their home port, either the beloved or the wife or even the mother. Surely all mariners have that. And there is no such person in the Ancient Mariner. And again, the question of solitude is brought up in this poem in a very intense way through that. The poem itself was walked into life. Again, there are wonderful pictures here because they walk over the Quantock Hills. It's up through the beech woods. And over the course of a week, on a walking tour, not at his desk, he talks this poem into life. I can give you one quote from Wordsworth remembering this. This is from the Prelude. Wordsworth says, "That summer, under whose indulgent skies upon smooth Quantock's airy ridge we roved, unchecked, or loitered mid her sylvan combs, thou in bewitching words with happy heart did chant the vision of that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner." That's from the Prelude, and there's something very interesting hidden away in there. He says, "with happy heart." And yet this is the poem he was writing. And again, there's a mystery. Is in some way, was this poem delivering Coleridge himself for certain guilts and terrors that he had? And that, again, is involved in the poem. Just a couple more things about sources, because I really don't want to go on too much longer, so we open this up. But the whole question of where the idea of the albatross itself came, I discovered that as a child, he was a voracious reader. He read a story of somebody called Philip Quall, who's like Robinson Crusoe, who was marooned on an island. And there's a famous passage in which he shoots a beautiful seabird with a bow he's constructed. So Coleridge read this probably at 10 years old, and that image is there. Then later on, when he's a student at Cambridge, he writes an extraordinary poem about a donkey in a field. And he says, we are brothers. Mankind is brothers to the animals. And he's mocked for this poem all his life. Byron indeed writes and calls him the laureate of the long-eared kind, all right, because of the donkeys. So that's already in there. Then I discovered that after Cambridge, he ran away, in effect, from university. He joined the Dragoons, like his two brothers, who were in the army, who admired, but who one of them was already dead at this time. And he was a hopeless soldier. He was meant to be riding a horse, a dragoon, and he kept falling off. And the army has a way of dealing with people like him. So they gave him a pest house to look after. And in his letters, he describes how he nurses a fellow trooper who's got smallpox, probably a lethal disease, all right? And they just lock Coleridge in, Trooper Coleridge, known as Cumberbatch, his own name, with his fellow dragoon, who hallucinates, who has the most terrible dreams. And Coleridge is left feeding him and with buckets of water, mopping his brow. And the dragoon survives probably through Coleridge's nursing. It lasts 7 days, which also appears in the poem. So he's had experience, never mind opium, he's had experience of this kind of hallucination. When he gets to the little cottage on Quantock, he's married by then. He has a problem, a domestic problem, which is mice. They have a lot of mice in the house. And his young wife says, Coleridge, you must get rid of the mice. And Coleridge doesn't want to. And this is what he writes in a letter about the mice. He said, this is probably about 9 months before he began the poem. The mice play the very devil with us. It irks me to set a trap. By all the whiskers of all the kittens that have ever mewed, plaintively or amorously, since the day of Dick Whittington, it is not fair. It is not just. It is telling a lie. 'Tis as if I said, here is a little bit of toasted cheese. Come, little mouse, I invite you. When, oh, foul breach of the rights of hospitality, we've heard that before, I mean to assassinate my too credulous guest. All right. So, and a very important thing, there's no doubt, it's the laws of hospitality, that's exactly what he put in the Mariner argument. But a very important thing, and for a biographer very significant, is that a major poem like this, a tragic poem, one of the parts of the inspiration begin in a joke, in a domestic joke about mice. And that is very important, the way various levels of the mind link up. So the joke opens the world of the mariner and the world of the rights of hospitality to Coleridge in a quite unexpected way. There are other influences, like he reads the travel books of Shelley, Great Voyage, where indeed there's a man called Captain Hatley who shoots an albatross. It's in Shelley's Voyages. So again, you have that repetition. So the imagery builds up in that way. The walk they made, which I've mentioned, I was going to show you, but what I particularly wanted to show you, that when you come down off the Quantock Hills, in the little harbour they get to, Watchet Harbour, there is now the bronze statue of an ancient mariner. So suddenly the poem has leapt into life in the most extraordinary way. And there are very many other examples of that. Now, we could perhaps talk separately about the strange figures on the boat, but I want to read, before we open it up, wider discussions, because you've been very patient, and I'm really sorry about the lack of pictures, but maybe something about the verse will stay with you. Let me just read one last passage here. This is very, I think, singularly beautiful, and I was going to show you a picture of the astronomical clock, which is in the church at Ottery, which is still there, which all three brothers grew up knowing. And it's a clock with the Earth at the center, and the moon and the stars moving around it. So again, as a child, that imagery was in his head, and I think he connected it with his brothers. I've told the story elsewhere of how all the brothers carved their initials in a cave just outside Ottery, and those initials are still there. So the brothers were very important in India. Here's this one image, and then what he then added to it. The moving moon went up the sky, and nowhere did abide. Softly it was going up, with a star or two beside. And that image is there, I'm sure inspired by the clock as well. And then, years later, the poem was originally published in 1798. In 1817, he adds a prose gloss, which increases the mystery. And this is the gloss he wrote to that verse I've just read you, the moving moon. In his loneliness and fixedness, he yearneth towards the journeying moon, and the stars that still sojourn, yet still move onwards. And everywhere the blue sky belongs to them, and is their appointed rest, and their native country, and their natural home, which they enter unannounced as lords that are certainly expected, and yet there is silent joy at their arrival. It seems to me one of the most extraordinary passages. It deals with the question of loneliness and then deals with the connection with the natural world and the sense that the natural world has a home. The stars have a home to come to. The mariner does not have that. That's what he's longing for. And that moves out into the imagery of the poem as well. And so it creates a kind of resonance, a kind of halo around the poem. So we know we're not simply dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome. We are dealing with a much larger story here, a spiritual story about loneliness, about the relationship between man and nature. And that's, I think, at this stage where I'll keep it. There are lots of other questions, but I would say if somebody asked why that poem, why you're still studying it, why it still seems to touch us, it's partly because of the music and the imagery, and I could have showed you those wonderful pictures by Doré. But also, it's a poem about man damaging nature. That seems to me an aptly central theme. And in a key way, do you remember, there's no answer to why did the mariner shoot the albatross? That key word, unaware. And it arrives again when he blesses the creatures in the sea. I bless them unaware. So Coleridge leaves us with that question, why are we damaging nature unaware? And why are we so lucky to be able to bless it, often unaware as well? That seems to me a completely modern question, an environmental question, a question of, when we're talking about, we started with the rain, the resources of the earth, damaging them or looking after them. That seems to me what the poem is about, from the little mouse in the house to the albatross in the sky and the polar spirit. And this poem will go on resonating in many continents. So that's the first part. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It's absolutely fascinating to hear about Rime of the Ancient Mariner, especially for a student and a teacher of literature. I wanted to ask you that what is the relationship between sublime and wonder in Romanticism, and how the Rime of the Ancient Mariner becomes an example of the sublime, right?
Is an exploration of that idea of the sublime and the terrible, but seen in the connection between writers and poets and the scientists of the period. Now, the kind of symbolic representation of this is the novel written by Mary Shelley,
Right.
amazingly young, started drafting at 17 and a half, amazing. And this, of course, is Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. And this is an examination of what science might be able to produce, based, in fact, on the latest lectures of Humphrey Davy, the great chemist of the period, who was using electricity, not necessarily to bring things back to life, but in fact almost to do the reverse, to open up various chemical elements and see what they were made of by using particular kinds of batteries. And Mary Shelley uses that image and to take the idea of what is the spark of life, could you re-engender it in a dead body? In fact, it's anatomy in reverse. Frankenstein assembles a body and then puts the spark of life back. And that's an image of the power of science, but also the terrible things it might do. And again, it's very characteristic of a romantic work, this. It just bounces straight out at us now, because we are grateful and aware of the power of science. We couldn't possibly live without it. But we are also frequently frightened and alarmed by it, and alarmed by its prospects. So that beauty and terror is an issue all the way through. And in that book, The Age of Wonder, it's the scientists and the poets talking about this very, very question. I'll give you one specific example. Coleridge becomes a great friend of Davy, the young chemist. And the first set of experiments that Davy does is with a kind of a gas, laughing gas, nitrous oxide. It's a new gas that they form in an artificial air. And Davy is trying to find out what you can do with it. He thinks you can cure the great disease of the period, consumption. That's his original idea. But what he finds, it's a kind of anesthetic, an idea that simply didn't exist as a concept. And the notion that you might be able to use this gas to do pain-free operations, or indeed pain-free childbirth, which is the way it's still used, right? Now, while he was doing those experiments, can you believe he made friends of Coleridge and Robert Southey, and they were volunteers to test out the gas. And their accounts of what it was like as an experience exist, and some of them, I have to say, are very, very funny. Coleridge gets out of hand. Davy tries himself and punches somebody. And these are all recorded, but also in the papers, Davy actually suggests that this gas could be used as an anesthetic in operations. And then, and here's a very interesting thing, there's an exchange of letters between Coleridge the poet and Davy the scientist about the nature of pain itself. Why is there pain? What is it for? Does it have a function? In a religious context, which they were using, why did God create pain? Why particularly did God create pain in childbirth? This is in this exchange of letters between the poet and the scientist. And they discuss this, and of course, the ambiguity of it, what is pain for? Surgeons at the time had a theory that pain was necessary during operations to help the healing process. This is a great period of amputations, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars, all done without anesthetic. And yet their science had the key to producing an anesthetic. And there the poet and the scientist discussing the function of the thing it was trying to cure or save us from. That's just a tiny example. And you get that right through the period. Shelley and astronomy and so on, Keats, who was a medical student. And again, you get the possibility that science will produce something marvelous and wondrous for us. And then that it's a double edge, that it may also do something dangerous for us. So that's becomes one of the themes of the book.
Like Frankenstein again.
Yeah.
The other thought is that when we say that the mariner did not know why he shot that albatross, the other question is the question of tragic flaw. Can we see a connection between tragic flaw and guilt in this poem?
Yeah, I think it's one of the themes of it is the whole notion of solitude itself. Why is the mariner so alone? When we meet him, he's outside the wedding feast. Normal life, in a sense, is going on, and he is cut off from that. So the sense of that guilt, which perhaps inspired him to shoot the albatross in the first place, and certainly carried with him. And a biographer would ask, why did Coleridge himself feel that? And I think there are quite complicated reasons, not simply to do with his opium taking, but to do with his relationships with his family. And I would bring back the two brothers who I said were out here. Both of them died, and both of them probably committed suicide. And he knew that. And he felt in some way responsible that he should have been out there. So there's quite a deep influence that goes through that. And in a lot of the poems, you find that. And the idea of escaping from this, for example, in Kubla Khan, is repeated. And in his later poetry and in the Biographia Literaria, a great prose work. And one thing which probably the students here study that, one thing I would say about that is written in 1813-14. What people don't seem to realize, it's written in the period that Coleridge is trying to go cold turkey to stop taking opium. So it's a book written in extreme physical crisis. It's quite extraordinary he wrote it at all. And it becomes partly autobiographical and partly a discussion of the greatness of Wordsworth's poetry, and indeed the themes of the sublime and the beautiful, and particularly the connection that Wordsworth has established with nature. That's all in the Biographia Literaria, which also describes why they decided to write the lyrical ballads, which of course the Mariner kicks that off in the first edition. And they say, for a very simple reason, they wanted to earn some money to go to Germany. But of course, it's much more complicated than that, and Wordsworth then responds with particular poems like Tintinnabee and the memory and poems about Dorothy and so on. So there's a very complicated link, and the Mariner poem is embedded in that. But Coleridge takes it on, as I say, he rewrites it at certain points throughout his life. The last version known is probably in 1827, which is about 5 years before he died, 6 years before he died. So that poem lives right through his own life. And again, for a biographer, there's the thought that in some way he predicted his own life. We were talking about time travel. yesterday. Very, very interesting presentation by Jim Al-Khalili. But there's time travel in another way that poets seem to have access to. And it's as if he looked forward in his life. He'd already written the poem that was going to describe his life. And it comes to meet him as an old man. And when he's at Highgate, and there's young John Stuart Mill, Thomas Carlyle come to see him up there, the sage of Highgate, they describe him as if he was the ancient mariner. And he had the look of the ancient mariner in his eye. So there's that extraordinary time loop. Now, looking at time loop, how are we doing for time?
I think it's time for questions, is it? Yeah? Yeah. Questions, please? Could you just wait for a minute? Thank you.
Is that working?
I wanted to ask you, I myself have been a student and a teacher of English literature. It might sound a little sacrilegious, because Wordsworth described poetry as spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. I often have myself wondered that something which has been written spontaneously and a powerful overflow of emotions, when we analyze it and explain it, don't we really, impair the beauty of the poetry by describing and analyzing it like this?
I see where you're coming from.
Yeah, because
yes.
Maybe the poet, it is very difficult to read the mind of the poet, so we assign it so many meanings, and sometimes one gets lost. The real meaning might be lost, and sometimes I really wonder whether the poet intended to convey so many feelings and emotions as we try to find in it. So what is your take on that?
So this is a question particularly addressed to a biographer, perhaps, is how far do we want to look at the roots of the poem? How far do we want to interpret it? I have to say, I think it's a very good question, because Coleridge himself, by having 3 separate versions of it, made it more and more complicated. The first little argument is not the last. He rewrites the opening, and most important of all, he writes what's called the prose gloss, which is as if it was written by somebody else, some antiquarian, who interprets this pretty well as a Christian allegory. And I don't think that's entirely there in the poem. So Coleridge is deliberately mystifying, all right. Now, I think there is actually a kind of romantic doctrine behind this, which is the poem is more powerful if it remains to some degree unexplained. It's the same principle as the Kubla Khan principle. The poem is more powerful if it appears to be unfinished. And I think this connects with a discussion that came up about Hindu architecture, where the pillars, one of the pillars is not finished, because that leaves the idea that something could be taken on, something could be developed. So, and I think that's almost deliberate for Coleridge, that it's more powerful. The meaning cannot be explained. It loops around, and that means it remains open to us now. For example, I introduced a very modern idea, this is post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is just one way of looking at this poem. But he's left it open. It's available to that kind of interpretation. So I think you put your finger there on a sort of romantic principle, really. Is that the notion of, we sometimes thought, the ruin poem, the unfinished work, the inexplicable thing, makes it more powerful. But I don't, as a biographer, I think it helps to try and see how a poem grew. And I find personally, once somebody's heard, say, the mouse story, you never look at the poem quite the same way, and it gives you this rather important idea that a sublime piece of work can partly come out of what was a simple domestic joke. And I think that's very important too.
Thank you. Question?
Microphone so everybody can hear.
Even at the risk of looking too much into it, would you say we each one of us has an albatross to carry, and the ancient mariner actually killed the albatross once we lay our own albatross down, when we are done with our albatrosses?
I think the ability of the Romantics to produce images that stay with us, I mean, that's an absolute proverbial phrase, isn't it? An albatross around your neck. In the same way as Mary Shelley produced the idea of the Frankenstein's monster, often mistaken for Frankenstein himself. There's a series of symbols that the Romantic poets are able to produce. Whether the idea that we all have an ancient mariner in us, I think is quite a powerful one, and particularly the degree to which the poem is about guilt and solitude. But that's very characteristic of Romantic poetry, that it is about subjective experience, which is common experience. So I think we all sail on a kind of existential ocean, and we have these moments, and I think the poem is partly about that. So.
Question.
A very insignificant question indeed, related to the poem, that when the ship moves to South Pole,
Yes.
it is wondrous cold, exceedingly cold over there, and huge icebergs, come floating by, and just as you recited,
Yes.
that it as green as emerald. So that has been troubling me ever since, that how could the icebergs, why did the poet use this simile? How could the icebergs be as green as emerald and not as white as diamond?
Yes.
And one thing more, because what to my knowledge is that there could be no vegetation in South Pole, I believe, throwing their light on the icebergs. So could you please throw some light on the fact that why the poet, how the poet, could use this simile?
Have you been on an Arctic cruise down to south? No? Have you seen an iceberg?
No, I
No.
haven't.
Well, they have
I
many colours.
haven't, but I have imagined, I know as it goes.
No.
Like icebergs, south to South Pole could have, I don't know exactly, but I think there could be no vegetation in South Pole, throwing their light on icebergs, or their color rather on icebergs.
Okay. You think, yes, the green might have come from vegetation. Well, icebergs actually can be all kinds of colors, but here's the point, and it's very well raised, is what did Coleridge know about sailing? Well, he knew his brothers had sailed to India and he'd got the letters back, but in fact, the furthest he'd sailed when he wrote that poem was across the River Avon from Somerset to Wales. That's the furthest he's gone on the little ferry, all right? And what's so fascinating, and we're talking about time loops, is he does finally sail later in his career. He sails out, again, this is quite forgotten, that he leaves the Lake District, and in the Napoleonic Wars, he sails out to Malta for all kinds of reasons, partly to do with his opium, partly to do with his unhappy marriage. He becomes the second chief administrator in wartime Malta. Now, the passage out there takes weeks and weeks, and he observes the sea. And there are wonderful bits in his journal where he says, I got it right. I'd never seen it before. I got it right. And I'll read you, in fact, a perfect opportunity for where he develops this idea of getting it right. Let's see if I can just quickly find the passage, which I may not be able to do. Where we got to? Salesman, statesman. Yeah. Okay. The first part of this he wrote in the first edition, and the second stanza he wrote when he came back from Malta. The sun's rim dips, the stars rush out. At one stride comes the dark. With far-heard whisper o'er the sea, off shot the spectre bark. And now the new stanza. We listened and looked sideways up. Fear at my heart, as at a cup, my lifeblood seemed to sip. The stars were dim and thick the night. The steersman's face by his lamp gleamed white. From the sails the dew did drip. Till clomb above the eastern bar the horned moon with one bright star within the nether tip. Now, in his journals, he was on the deck of that ship sailing to Malta, and he saw that image of the steersman standing against the sale, and it's in his journal, and then he takes it and puts it in the poem. So his literal knowledge of what this was, it was imaginary knowledge. But gradually he feeds in new knowledge. And as I say, this makes this poem very curious in its time structure. The mariner himself is a young mariner, but when he tells the story, he's an old mariner. The poem is a very young poem of Coleridge's, 25 or 6, but he finishes it quite late in his life. So the time loops in this, and it changes from that point of view, I think. So I shouldn't worry too much about the reflection of green, all right? He also may have liked the word emerald in that line, I think, okay? Because there are a lot of internal rhymes, and the rhyme with cold and emerald is very important there, okay? So, yeah.
I think we have time
Anyway,
for
thank
one
you.
last question.
Good afternoon, sir. Okay, so we've been told that both Wordsworth and Coleridge had this, post-Paradise Lost, they had this, they wanted to write another epic. Because after Paradise Lost, everyone thought that, oh, okay, so if I'm a normal guy who's writing poetry, I could probably write the next big epic. Do you think, and we also know of a lot of unfinished works of these poets. So do you think that there's this preoccupation of writing at least like a small epic in the finished works of Coleridge and Wordsworth?
Yes. Very good. It's a very good question, and it's absolutely right. They were haunted by the epic of Milton, particularly Paradise Lost. And in many ways, even in their small poems, they were trying to create a kind of Paradise Lost. Wordsworth, all his life, wanted to write an epic poem. He wrote a poem called Excursion, which is not a great success. What he, very characteristically, the epic he did write was the prelude, his own life. And of course, it wasn't published till after his death. So he never, as it were, as a writer, had the satisfaction of seeing that poem out. But that would be the equivalent, would be Wordsworth's prelude in 12 or 14 books, depending. And it's also true of Coleridge. But Coleridge wanted to write a philosophic epic. And all his life, he said he was preparing to write this philosophic epic. And in the end, it's just notes in his notebook. And his friend, but also his enemy, Hazlitt, said at one point, Mr. Coleridge's whole life is a continued preface and prologue to his work, all right? And there's something in that. Hazlitt, a very shrewd critic, and so on. But in a way, again, it's very interesting biographically, the desire to write this epic, to challenge Milton on his own ground, is like a curious sort of, for a writer, it's like an umbrella that you hold up, and beneath this, you're never going to do that. It gives you a freedom to work in smaller forms. And the Immortality Ode, say, in Wordsworth, which is about Paradise Lost, but in half a dozen stanzas, all right? So he never achieves the big one, but he achieves, beneath the shelter of that, a whole series of either finished or fragmentary poems. And I have to say, that goes right on in English literature with Tennyson, who's longing to write an epic, and what he actually writes is the Arthurian poems, the Idylls of the King and so on, which, curious enough, are turned into, they're really dinosaurs in the poetry world in many ways, all right? But his most beautiful and memorable poems are short poems, and of course, in memoriam. So that epic desire, Keats had the same, and you could expand this out. They want, both Keats and Shelley desired to challenge Shakespeare by writing plays. And Keats did write Otto the Great and so on. Shelley wrote a series of plays, which took 100 years to be staged, right? So this is a very interesting thing about the psychology of the writer, what the challenge is, what he's trying to match, he or she is trying to match, and what new forms they create while they struggle to match the old form. So it's a very interesting question, that. And that seems to me that the use of the old epic form is as a challenge, and it allows the writer to work in a new way. Coleridge said to Wordsworth, you must create the taste by which you are appreciated. You need new forms to do that. They can't be repeated. And I would say that continues in modern poetry, the desire to write an epic, very, very difficult to do. Perhaps epics belong to a certain period in historical time or not. So, Good question.
I'm afraid we will have to finish there.
Yeah.
I think we'll have to conclude this. 1 hour is simply too less time for any discussion on romanticism. I think everybody would agree here. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you after the next session.